the sector. And then we are very privileged to have a perspective from Uruguay, and Sebastian Torres will present the Uruguayan experience. So the way, and we'll get obviously some comments from the floor. The way I'd like to do this is the presentations have to be 20 minutes maximum. I'm going to be pretty strict about that, so the two speakers be warned. And then open up, there'll be enough time for us to actually engage. So once we've received the presentations, we'll try and pull together some threads for that engagement to happen. So Richard, 20 minutes starts now, and as I said, I'm going to be monitoring it.
Right. Okay, so the topic is very broad, and I won't try and do it total justice, but one of the things I will be talking about is stuff that has come up under the theme of renewable energy industrialization. So this is a term that was thrown around, as much as 6-7 years ago, I think, and has been supported by a bunch of civil society organizations, including Earthlife, which in end of 2016 put out a document called Renewable Energy Plan A as a fast track to renewables in South Africa. But just for a bit of history, back in 98, we got the white paper. It was envisaged back in 98 that renewables development would happen under government. And the white paper said that an equitable amount of resources would go to the development of renewables, as goes to other primary sources of energy, commensurate with their potential. So that was the approach to renewables that was embraced in the white paper. We're going to do this thing. It's going to take a while, but then in 2002, there was some pressure on because we were hosting the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and Eskom said we will reduce our dependence on coal by 10% within 10 years. They didn't even manage 1%, as it turned out. But anyway, that was Eskom saying we're going to start diversifying. So it was expected that Eskom was going to be doing quite a bit in renewables. They had a CSP pilot plant, they had a wind pilot plant. In time for the summit, they got a wind turbine up at Klippieville, which they put on their website. So this was the expectation, that Eskom was going to be making renewables happen. Okay. There was also talk about, that defined concession areas where the private sector, in one case, a company in partnership with Eskom, and Eskom was a partner in one of the concession areas, to do solar photovoltaic for the remote rural areas. 2003, we got a renewable energy white paper, but it didn't decide on a mechanism to support renewables. So it said we could go with a feed-in tariff, or we could go with what they were calling a portfolio standard, or what some people call an obligation. Didn't make up their minds. 2009, solar water heating. Suddenly people were like, oh, my God, we don't have enough electricity. Why are we using electricity to heat up our water? That's a bit dark. We're going to do solar water heating. Again, Eskom was involved, big ambitious targets, which weren't realized, including for 1 million systems. 2010, we got a draft revised renewable energy white paper as far as the DOE, where it was promptly buried. It was a very ambitious thing. It's a really interesting document. And that similarly was looking to a program that would be based out of Eskom. But then around 2010, 2011, there was also an initiative that Salim could tell us about. I've forgotten the acronym, about looking for an investment vehicle for renewables. Sorry? Sorry, yes, the South African Renewables Investment Initiative. Thank you. I couldn't remember the bloody acronym. And that was launched in 2011 at COP17. And that was similarly not geared to the IPP procurement approach. But while that was happening on one level, Treasury, Department of Energy, some DTI folks were getting together, and they were saying, well, what are we going to do? And they came up with the IPP unit, the independent, and independent here being independent of Eskom. So it doesn't speak to whether these entities would be largely privately owned or whatever. It just said independent of Eskom. There will be an office to deal with this, because Eskom was struggling to get Medupi and Kusile built. We didn't have enough capacity, so it was decided, okay, we need to bring some other players in. So that's kind of where the shift really started to happen, from expecting it to be done by the state and by Eskom to going to the IPPs. And as a result of that initiative, by mid-2017, we had 1,500 megawatts of wind, about the same as solar PV, 200 megawatts of CSP, I think the last that came online since then has been another 108 in 2017. So there's some figures here about the performance of that capacity. So maximum daily load. These just give you an indication of what we're actually getting out of them compared to the rated capacity installed. The point is we have quite a strong growth. This is from the Renewable Energy Data and Information Service, which I'd encourage you to look at. It's on the Department of Energy's website. I'm not going to try and explain what all of this is. You can just see it's a lot of growing, and the details are all on this web. One of the good things about the IPP office is that it has introduced far more transparency than we've ever had before in terms of contracting. So not that I'm saying that that means it's the right approach, but one of the good things we've got out of it is a whole lot more access to data than we had before. And so you can see what the different plants are, technologies, etc. They also report on performance. This just shows you photovoltaics. The blue is the actual performance. The green is the performance that was assumed in our integrated resource plan. So actual performance of the technologies has exceeded the expectations and assumptions in our planning. They also give detailed breakdowns of who owns what, how much investment is local, how much is foreign. I'm not going to show you all the details of this, just to say that that information is there. And so please do think about having a look at it. But we don't have time to go into it in detail. In the meantime, Project 90 has been coming out with some very useful publications, including one called Transforming the Energy Sector, which really tries to deconstruct or unpack the different things that are involved. They've also done a publication on ownership. Don't read through the contents, that's just to give you a snapshot, that it does get into things like community ownership, what does it mean? So there's a lot of work being done, and the changes and the work being done also include people who used to be positioned very differently, including the energy intensive users group, who used to very much argue that we need big coal-fired power stations to provide the cheapest available electricity so that we can do big industrialization. That was their whole approach, so they were very much behind Eskom being a provider of cheap electricity. Now, Piet van Staden of Sasol, writing, this was late last year, being both sunny and windy due to our location at the tip of the continent, presents us with a sustainable competitive advantage in the new energy paradigm, provided we do not score an own goal by continuing to develop energy plans that are out of sync with the modern reality, by building inflexible baseload generation, which is incompatible with the least cost future electricity industry based on renewables and flexible backup generation. That's not coming from the renewables industry, that's coming from the energy intensive users. And just recently, Van Staden was on a public platform and said, we used to say that we can't do this, that, or the other with renewables. No longer the case. Okay, so they no longer say we can't put a mine 3 kilometers underground just on renewable energy. They reckon that they can do anything that you want to do with renewables. We have a lot of this sort of analysis that comes from the CSIR. I'm putting this one up just as another example of the kind of analysis that happens. This looks at a snapshot 2040 with 3 different build programs. So you've got what was the base case a couple of years ago in our integrated resource plan, a carbon budget case, which it's questionable whether that's really a carbon budget or a gentle constraint, but anyway. And then if you do it by least cost. And the jobs figures that they routinely spit out of this modeling that they do at CSIR now indicates that when we go with a high concentration of renewables, you get more jobs. The reason that there's 2 figures in a range is because CSIR said we don't believe the assumptions that DOE has taken from EPRI, the California Institute. We think that coal is more employment intensive in South Africa. So they did the number crunching with the DOE's assumptions, and then they put in a higher number for coal employment, and they ran the model with that because they said we think in South Africa we do get more jobs, and that's why here the difference between this 234,000 and 258,000, that's less jobs in coal because it's an EPRI assumption for the United States. That's more jobs from coal because of the South Africa tailored assumption. If you want to know more about how they get these numbers, the new book by Bischoff Nimps, who led that work at CSIR, and the engineering news guy, has the, I'm going to show you a couple of pages I scanned. We don't have time to look at the details of it. It's just to let you know that unpacking these numbers that get spat out in this high-level modeling, what's behind it. So They talk about CapEx-related jobs, capital expenditure, and operational expenditure-related jobs. They're broken down into direct jobs and then the supplier jobs. So jobs by the people employed in what they're spending the capital on, building plant, and suppliers to the builders of the plant, and then same thing operationally. So they break it all down. They give the numbers that are associated with CapEx and OpEx for the different technologies. They put all of that into these graphs which show you different employment levels from different technologies, direct or direct and supplier. Okay? Deliberately not leaving those slides up there because we don't have time to unpack them, but it's there in the book. I was asked to say something about jobs, that's it. So, where are we going? Can we have a roadmap to 100% renewables? If we want to, we need to rethink the energy system. This is the argument that Earthlife was making a couple of years ago. Decentralization with energy democracy, electrification of transport, universal access to electricity with solar PV, a biomass energy strategy. We haven't talked about that much, but it's really important for access to basic energy services, and a lot of work could be done to make the biomass use that does happen more sustainable. Regional cooperation, I think was mentioned yesterday, particularly when it comes to biomass and the potential production of biofuels. South Africa, water scarce. Tanzania, Malawi, greater opportunities for producing biomass for energy. Why should we do it unsustainably in South Africa when our neighbors could be doing it in a more sustainable way? And then redirecting investment and phasing out fossil fuels. There's a bit more on what is meant by Plan A, but the core of it is, it's about getting decisive. Rather than an energy mix, which has become a password for we'll try and keep everybody happy, we need to decide what works for us best, what offers us the best opportunities, and what doesn't. So I would like to banish the term energy mix entirely because it's so vague, and it really doesn't help us to be decisive about where to direct investment, where we can develop jobs. And there's a 16-step program that was suggested in that publication by Earthlife. I'm not going to go through all of the steps. I'm just going to mention 4 of them because this reflects on some of the things that people have been doing to try and get renewables going. So one of them is embracing energy democracy in principle and practice. That's just overriding. Stop pursuing the purchase of new nuclear. Well, we seem to have done that. That's great. Establish a new public enterprise for solar power. This is an idea that was floated in an AIDC publication. People didn't pick up on it. It doesn't seem to be that popular an idea. Why start again? Surely we've got to fix Eskom. But one of the positions that is being promoted is that if we're going to do renewables well, let's not saddle the renewable energy industry with all of the problems that come with Eskom. Enable the Working for Energy program to provide programmatic support for community-based energy planning and project development. So this is more of the energy democracy side of things. Let me push on. A proposal that AIDC made at the Jobs Summit colloquium convened by NEDLAC a couple of months ago is for a dedicated program just looking at solar photovoltaic, well, not just, primarily looking at solar photovoltaic as being driven by a universal access program. So if we agree we want universal access, and that, as government's research indicates, the most cost-effective way of doing that is through photovoltaic solar home systems, why don't we get serious? Set some big targets which will support local production of photovoltaic panels and associated wires, etc., equipment. Target the 3 million households that DOE has already identified as needing access to electricity. And not only will we be building an industry, but we'll be improving on service delivery, and we'll be improving on household health, opportunities for kids to study because they've got light at night, not with candles, that sort of thing. So how am I doing on time, Tasneem?
You have 10 minutes.
Cool.
But you don't have to take them.
So I would argue that there's no real prospect of sustaining or growing employment without an energy transition. We've not got a choice of, can we keep going with the way we are and things will be fine, or we choose a transition that goes to a low carbon economy. The way we're going is not fine. And we are, or Eskom has announced it's going to shed jobs. So it's not like we're moving away from a system that's providing everything that we want. Yeah. We've talked about how deep the financial hole Eskom is in. Some folks have said, well, why doesn't government just pay that debt? Because we need Eskom to be functional. But that doesn't actually pay the debt. All it does is it broadens the people who are affected by that liability. The liability doesn't reduce. If government says, we will put money that way, what it basically means is saying, we'll take the debt from Eskom and put it into the bigger fiscus, which it pretty much sits there effectively anyway. The business case for coal-fired power generation is falling away. That is just a result of the advancement of technologies, and in South Africa, the advancement in our knowledge of the renewable resource. Because we didn't understand how good our renewables were for many, many years. It's only been over the last 5 to 8 years that we've got a good understanding. So, and that's without enforcing compliance with air quality standards. Eskom is once again applying for more postponement of compliance with air quality standards, and it's before bringing in a carbon tax. So the business case is falling away anyway. And so I would argue without a planned and managed phase out of coal dependence, there's very likely going to be some kind of a crash, possibly fairly soon. Now, this is something that happened in the UK, and I'd be interested, Sean, I'm sure you can think of a number of reasons that are behind this, but 120 terawatt hours, that's about half of what Eskom puts out at the moment. We put out 240 terawatt hours a year. That's from the gate. Actual use is about 105 or so. So coal-fired power in the UK running at about half of the generation that Eskom generally does, and it was going up, got up to 140. It came down a bit with the recession there. That's around 2008. Now came down. It started to recover. It was getting close to 140 in 5 years. Dush, 85% of it fell away, even as the UK government was withdrawing the subsidies to renewables. Now, I'm sure there was a lot of variables involved in that, but that is the kind of thing we don't want to see happening in South Africa, right? 85%, no more market for coal-fired power. So this is why I'm saying a planned, managed transition is better than just leaving it to what might happen with the markets. And what position paper, which I didn't find online, so I'm not sure if it was ever actually fully finalized. So this, don't hold anybody else to account for this. It came through a bunch of emails, and my understanding was that it had been adopted. But that's why I put groundwork et al., because I'm not entirely sure of the status of it. But what it calls for, the undersigned organizations demand that future loans to Eskom should be conditional on this. So this isn't saying government must wave a magic wand and make this happen. It says you guys are out there getting money for Eskom. Let's put conditionalities. Eskom must do certain things if they are to get that money, underwritten by the state. Number one, accelerate decommissioning of 3 of its coal-fired power stations. Well, they've actually been doing that. I don't know how well you guys who work within Eskom are appraised of the status of all of the power stations, but we hear that some are now in cold storage. So they're not decommissioned, but they're not running at full capacity. And rather than just kind of fuzzling along, we would like to see a decommissioning plan, particularly where there's problems with coal supply, and coal has to be trucked over very long distances, which applies to one of these 3, I forget which one. Also that Eskom should curtail the completion of Kusile units 5 and 6. So that's 1/3 of Kusile. Now, we don't know, because we're not privy to all the contracts, how much capital outlay could be averted, or how much costs might be saved by doing this. The information is not in the public domain. But certainly, can anyone tell us about the penalty clauses that Eskom invoked when the people they pay to build these power stations started running over time? The costs have escalated and escalated. But the money is being paid to companies like Hitachi to build these things. So why haven't there been penalty clauses invoked against the people who were contracted to do all this building? We're not clear. We'd like to have that in a debate in the public domain. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones. Number 6 is that South African government and Eskom should adopt appropriate policies to ensure the unhindered rollout of renewable energy. This is where we start to get into like different ideas of what is required. Resolving Eskom's inherent conflicts of interest by transforming Eskom's transmission division into an independent transmission system and market operator, an ITSPO. That is a message that's coming from a number of different constituencies. Number two, allowing and enabling municipal electricity distributors to produce and or procure their own renewable energy. Cape Town is involved in a case to assert this right. The last I heard, it wasn't going that well, but I don't have an update. I'd love to hear from anyone who can tell us how the City of Cape Town's challenge to be able to procure and or produce. Now, if they're procuring, they could be procuring from their own communities, in theory. So that is potentially a way of unlocking community ownership in renewable generation. Removing barriers for Eskom or units currently within Eskom to produce its own renewable energy, which is a way of saying, you know, we're not saying Eskom shouldn't do it. We don't know why Eskom isn't doing it. We've got some theories, but it should be very clear that Eskom does have a mandate to do it. Because there's some people have been saying that Eskom now isn't allowed to because it can't go through the IPP system. But just because they can't go through the IPP unit or office doesn't mean that they can't be doing renewables, as far as we know. But we would like that, well, Groundwork et al. Would like that made explicit. There's a little more on what the transition might really look like if we went beyond meeting electricity to serve the energy system we have as a country as a whole. So when Bishop Nipson Kramer look at the prospects over time, they're looking beyond simply current electricity use. I encourage you to read the book. Yesterday there was a question about resources. This is just one example, it's my second last slide. One example of our improved understanding of the resource base in South Africa. And this relates to wind, and what it shows is the load factor that can be achieved with a big wind turbine. So this is with a hub height of 100 meters across South Africa, based on 3 years of weather data. So they took 3 years of weather data and then they modeled putting turbines in different places. What is the load factor you could get off of the latest turbines? And so you'll see that a lot of the country, I mentioned yesterday, even up by Messina, that we didn't realize there was some serious wind up there. The load factor around here that would be achieved is starting to get down to the load factor that Germany achieves. Okay. Spain has a better resource than Germany, so typically they're in that sort of range. Clearly we have a world-class wind resource. So it doesn't do justice to all of the things that have been happening to try and get renewables going, but I hope gives you a bit of a sense. I would argue that the very most important thing for growing renewable energy industries with local manufacturing in South Africa is that we can't let other countries get hold of our transmission grid. So, you know, when loans are being taken up, some years back, Eskom gave as a primary reason for opposing unbundling, in other words, for staying as a vertically integrated utility, that if they broke up their asset base, it would increase their cost of capital, it would negatively impact on their potential to raise capital. So the separation of Eskom assets would have exposed Eskom generation. It might have done us a favor, but that was the argument, is that, you know, Eskom has this asset base, so it's in a position to do big projects, to get finance at preferable rates, etc. We don't break it up. But we don't know to what extent transmission and distribution infrastructure are treated as collateral for Eskom's debt. We know that they said they want to keep this united asset base with vertical integration because of what it will allow them to do by way of raising capital. That would suggest that maybe some of those assets are somehow, I'm not a financier, I don't know the details of this kind of thing, but it is a pertinent question as to what extent are we putting it at risk. If we're going to plan for successful localization of manufacturing, we need scale. You need to tell people that we're going to be building a lot of these things if you want them to build them here, and we need consistency. Not saying we'll do it, oh, but then we won't for a few years, and then we... So, that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. We'll move straight on to Sebastian.
O con Enter, cualquiera. Con el Enter. Ah, pero que estás moviéndose solo. A veces se activa el... Ahí quedaste.
Okay.
So, good morning, everyone, comrades. It's really nice to be here. I'm delighted to share the insights of this Uruguayan energy transition. And I think I'm going to be quite straightforward about it. So I'm going to mention the lights and the shadows, because for good or for worse, I was involved directly in this transition. I worked during 10 years in the government in different positions. One of them was as National Director of Industry in the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining. We have all these three sectors combined into one ministry. So basically, we are going to talk about our experience in Uruguay. And I think everything that is going to be said, even this first part, which relates to the historical background in Uruguay, is also directly related to energy transition. And you will see what I mean by that. I will start by saying that if you want to go through a renewable transition process, you need a political basis to do that. Yes, you need to know the technology. Yes, you need to know the cost of production. Yes, you need to know all the details, of course, because you need to run eventually the state-owned enterprise in a good way. But for me, the most important thing is to have the right political base, or if you want, the right institutions in a more rather back sense. So allow me just 2 minutes to explain to you that in 2004, for the first time in our country's history, the left won the elections. And we won again in 2009 and 2014. And this is crucial. Why? Because without this government, we wouldn't have done this transition. And I'm sure about that. With all the good things and the bad things, without a government running the country during 15 years, it wouldn't have been impossible to do that. And I mention this because in our country, what I refer as the left is a big coalition who has been together since 1971 in opposition and in government. So what we have there is communists, socialists, social democrats, anarchists, Christians, you name it. Which is pretty interesting, I think, and this is a distinctive feature because you will say, okay, yeah, you have the left. We know that the left in many countries, of course, they are fighting each other and sometimes they don't even vote together. But we have this particularly distinctive feature going on since 1971. And it's important to mention it because, again, this is, I think, strictly and directly related to the energy transition process that we have. The other important thing, and I'm taking here a title that we used last week in a Croatian conference, which is moving beyond fragments. Yes, building on the same idea. Yes, we are fragmented, but we need to do things together between different collectives in society, is trade unions. Actually, trade unions in Uruguay, and I put this as a distinctive feature to unity as identity, before the political parties or these different fractions get together, the unions got together in Uruguay. So in 1966, the formal foundation of our CND, all the unions, again, all the different collectives that were fighting before, they decided to go together to build a common platform. So actually, in a sense, they were the ones telling the parties, yeah, 5 years later, 71, the Road Fraud Coalition was established, that, look, guys, if you want to transform this country, you need to get together. And of course, in that period was a period in Latin American history, you know that, particularly intense. So we were having in our country, the National Liberation Movement, basically having a war against the military and the government. So I said that this trade union in particular has proved one thing, which is, at least I will catalog it, or I will put it like that, is amazing, an amazing power to forge alliances. And I'm not talking about the alliances, the intra-alliances within the trade union system, but I'm talking about the alliances with the government, with the social movement, with the opposition parties, and with the private sector in the way that they negotiate. So again, this has a lot to do with the energy transition in Uruguay. Just to mention some of the things that they were able to do with the government after 2005, so we reestablished this wage council restoration. So basically all sectors in Uruguay are covered by this tripartite collective bargaining, all of them. And we passed around more than 30 new labor laws. The results 3 of them, and I will finish by that in respect with the unions. So you can imagine that our working population is 1,700,000, and we have more than 400,000 affiliations. So this is more like 40-something% in the private and public sector in Uruguay. And when many jobs were created, and we have these increases in wages. The trade unions do not depend on the political parties, do not depend on the government. They are autonomous. So sometimes they will tell the government, we are doing things in a correct way, and sometimes they will fight. They will occupy factories, and on the May the 1st, they will denounce the things that we are doing, that we were doing in a bad way. So this is how it works, at least from the political economy perspective. And to finish with this historical background, I think, yeah, we are talking, of course, about politics, economics. I think the social base in Uruguay is important, and this is just to give you a glimpse of things, of how Uruguayans have transformed themselves in terms of social policy. I just mentioned some of them. These are the six of them, some laws that were passed in Uruguay in the last 10 years. So I'm talking of access to water and sanitation as a human right. We have a transgender law, an abortion law, same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, and the Care Act. So this is, again,
marijuana as a human right.
We put it as a right. Yeah, it's a right. You know why we did that? Marijuana legalization, at least from the president perspective, he wants to combat drug trafficking, and we don't know how to do it. And in Uruguay, this is I mean, the violence. You got it. Do you know how this works? Do you know how this works? Do you know how this works? Actually, there are two interesting things. The first one is that you are allowed to have your own plants, so up to 6. If you register them, if you don't, you are going to jail. Number one. Number two, the state is in charge. Exactly what you said. We are the ones producing, state-owned, and then we are the ones selling. So we are. But what we want to do is actually to hit drug trafficking, at least at this small level. We are trying, it's an experiment. But anyway, I think it's important to understand what is the social fabric behind that. Yeah, illustrated in this small summary before going into the energy transition. So this is the new legislation related to social policy. So going straight to the energy transition, the process. I put it in this way, I just selected 5 dilemmas or 5 debates that we were having. Because again, it's important to put these things in context. Okay, what were we thinking back in 2005, 2008? The first thing was about dependency. And this situation is really different than the one that you have here, guys, and come. Uruguay, unfortunately, or you would say fortunately maybe, doesn't have oil, gas, coal, no cheap access to natural gas in the region. We didn't have enough room to build new hydropower plants. So in a sense, we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. So this question was about dependency. We didn't have a coal, to say, okay, what are we going to do with our coal and just discuss this transition in terms of renewables. We said, we are paying, the petrol at that time was more than 150, if you remember, during this period. So we don't have an option. Why? Because we are importing oil and oil is becoming expensive by the day. So what do? We go strictly and immediately to a policy of renewable energies. And this is important because one of the considerations that I think we have to take into account is the timing of this process. In Uruguay, we decided to do it very fast because of that, because this is our situation. We don't have any alternatives. So in that sense, this is what we did. We go with the wind, as Charles will put it in the article that you have with there. We decided to do that. But of course, we face a second dilemma. How do we do it? So we know that we need renewable energy. How do we do it? How do we plan for it? What are the right institutions? What is the legislation that we need? What are the decrees that we need? What is the capacity building that we need? Everything that you can imagine and that you have already mentioned. So 2 things, organization and planning. Basic perhaps, but sometimes they are not there when you think about policies. So what we did is mainly 3 things. We established a long-term policy, perhaps something similar to what you were saying, Richard, in terms of drafting, these white papers, organizing things, what we would like to achieve, the objectives, the targets, the goal, the indicators to measure, the evaluation that we were going to do of our policy. So a big comprehensive 2030 policy. We did that. What is perhaps more important than that is that in 2010, we went to the parliament as a government and we said to all political parties, are you backing us up or not? So are we going to do it as a government policy, or are you going to be voting for what we're going to do with the renewable sectors in particular? All political parties voted unanimously to go for this policy. And again, second, third, or fourth ingredient, you need to build, at least from our perspective, some consensus within society. If you can at the political level, with social movements, with trade unions. But you need to do that in order to have a long-term policy. The transition to renewables is going to take 40, 50, 60 years. We don't know. It depends on the country. It depends on the structural conditions of the country. But I think consensus is crucial. And of course, during the last 15 years, we passed more than 20 new laws and decrees to regulate the system. Because it was a huge impact, a new sector was actually increasing or being created in Uruguay, and we needed a new framework too. We didn't have that before, since the 90s and the like. So again, having said that, we basically defined this objective, pretty straightforward. Yeah? The most important one is we wanted to introduce renewables very fast. And you will see that this will, of course, eventually take us to some tensions in the process that we need to acknowledge. Having faced dilemma 2, we want to dilemma 3. Who is going to do it? So who is going to invest? Who is going to be in charge of the plan that we just agreed with all political parties? And we said, well, in Uruguay we have something, which is this, all these nice guys. These are all state-owned enterprises that were never privatized in Uruguay. So there is this strong tradition. Daniel mentioned something about that yesterday. So we say, yeah, UTE needs to be in charge of the process. So regulations, legislations. We were thinking at the time that we wanted to have our own wind farms. We have some of them, and most of them are private. I'm going to comment on that. But the main idea was that the state or the state-owned enterprise was becoming the leader of that. And this was a political decision. And we even were having fightings inside the coalition. Yeah, you might think that the more, I would put it in that way, right-wing guys will say, well, just leave it to the private sector. You can give the right incentives, they will invest. You will have the renewable transition immediately. We were saying, wait a moment, we are in a hurry, but we can slow down a bit. So let's try to combine. And this is what Uruguay did. We combined different, Daniel showed it yesterday, in terms of the wind farms. You saw that we have different modalities. I think you have to be open also to this. It's not everything state-owned or you're private. There are, you know, some small policy public spaces that you have, and you need to take this into account. So in Uruguay, then we face the dilemma 4. What do we do with the private sector? So what are the conditions, the incentives that they need in order to invest and to help us in this transition? Again, dilemmas. We give them everything, all the incentives that we can, or we just measure little by little, we go step by step, and we see what is the reaction. We went for this second possibility. So we said, okay, through different degrees, we started to auction the wind farms. And we were modifying year by year, depending on the research that we were having, the conditions that we were giving to the private sector in order to invest, apart from the state-owned farms that we have. I will resume, yes, and I will give you the 5, I think these are the 5 main incentives that were given to the private sector, very specific. So 20 years PPA, the corporate income tax, wealth tax, import tax, and fees and value-added tax. This is, and I will say at that time, I was not very happy with that. The discussion was inside the ministry now, not inside the government. Because I have a colleague who was the director of energy. Yes, I have the director of mining, I was the director of industry, so 3 of them. Of course, the director of energy was discussing this with me, and he was telling me, fast. I need this fast. Give them all the incentives, and I want to see changes in our matrix immediately, in 2-3 years' time. And I was telling him, well, look, I think that maybe this is too much. With maybe 1 or 2, and I will say maybe with the first 2 ones, yeah, the 20 years PPA and the corporate income tax rebate that they will get from their investment, this was enough. And I still think this is the case. I still think that they will have done their investment. Of course, I don't have a future board, and I cannot run a counter, evaluation of what happened. I don't have the history of what would have happened if we have implemented what I thought at the time. But I think 1 and 2 will have been enough. Actually, what is happening in Uruguay, and it happened maybe in other places, is that these guys who are for free markets and the like, what they are having right now is a monopsony. What do we mean by monopsony in economics? Is 5, 10, or 15 firms who have their demand secured. By whom? The state. This is easy. Why don't you give the same conditions to worker-owned factories, to cooperatives? And I'm talking about that because I'm relating to Brian's question. I'm going to relate to that in the end. What do we do next in terms of industrial policy, not only energy? So one of the things that I was discussing, and I think this is crucial, is to understand the amount of, let's put it in simple ways, money that was given to the private sector in general, all over the world, not only in Uruguay, and compare it with the different forms, for example, of production that we want to in farming, agroecological farming. So how much money are the guys working in this condition receiving? I'm just putting it in terms of money, not even in institution building, in capacity building, in access to market, in foreign trade related agreements. So anyway, this was a pause, but I think we need to think strategically about the decisions that we take. And I need to be blunt about it. This was the new investment regime for renewables in Uruguay. And in addition to that, we have our own state-owned wind farms. Yeah, we also have that. So a combination. Final dilemma, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I'm going to talk to what was the topic of the panel, which is, can we develop an industrial base through renewables? And this is the main thing. So we have this dilemma about industrial policy. And allow me to tell you how we organized industrial policy in Uruguay back in 2010. What we did was that we didn't want to draft the papers or the white papers on our own. What I mean by that is, I particularly didn't want the government to be drafting the papers with the technocrats and the bureaucrats and with consultations, with different people. I want the different collectives, if they agree to that, to be involved in the process of writing the industrial policy. What I mean by that is that we created 10 industrial councils with participation of the trade union, with participation of the private sector and of the academia, of the academic sector. So we were meeting, like the meeting we are having right now, with them and discussing what are our objectives, what are our goals, what are our different instruments, how do we do that, what are the tensions. And I mentioned something, of course. For example, one example, one of the main things that was always trying to conspire against this long-term planning, long-term thinking, was the one related with wages. Because if we are talking about the industrial policy council in metallurgy, the guys were coming to us and said, you are asking us to think in 20 years' time, and we have problems right now with our employment and our jobs. What was our answer? You have the tripartite council in the Ministry of Work to discuss these issues, which are short-term and are important for the government. But we need to be able to think ahead in 20 years' time. So we did that, different results. In the automotive sector, we have very good results in terms of planning and also in terms of economics. In some of them, like the pharmaceutical and biotechnology, we were not able to develop these sectors. So related with the energy sector, what we did was we get together, again, in the same framework, the different actors, and we asked them a very simple question. What can be produced in Uruguay? So the government or the state or all the political parties with the trade unions backing us are telling us you should go to renewables. You don't have another option. Okay. Is it possible to develop an industrial base? So what we were doing is just having a look at the different parts. We did that. And we mapped all the industry in Uruguay. So we were going to the firms and we were asking, the different owners, okay, can you produce an area? Can you produce a service crane? Can you produce a spinner? What can you produce here at all? And this was for me, as you might imagine, a crucial input in order to negotiate with my colleagues and to tell them, wait a minute, we can do some things here, don't rush, don't import everything. We did that, this took us like almost 1 year, unfortunately, and we concluded that not only through Uruguayan production, but also including the Brazilian and Argentinian counterparts, another dimension that was asked yesterday, by some of you in terms of regional integration, we could achieve at least produce 7 things. Towers, transformers, conductors, control center, fiberglass. So all of them, these are pictures, yes, taken from Uruguay. We could do steel towers, concrete towers, transformers, electric conductors, control centers, fiberglass aero parts, lightweight metallurgy, and services. And what we did, once we knew that, again, organization and planning, we implemented a decree. The decree was about 5 points. One is the most important one. 20% local contents for wind farms, and that's it. This is what we're going to do. We know that we could reach eventually 20% of required local content in our production. So this happens, so actually all the auctions included this clause, so all the wind farms have at least 20% of local content in Uruguay. And you might guess what happened at the WTO level. We got some recommendations from them. So this is actually from September 2013. I have many of them, which are really interesting. Uruguay, local content requirements for wind farm investments. Questions from the United States. So they were interested in our policy. And they were asking, the following communication dated 12 September 2013 is being circulated at the request of the delegation of the United States. They actually circulated 4 of these requests during 2010 and 2015, and all of them were about, are you discriminating? What is the position of our companies? Explain to us how we're going to implement this methodology. It looks very nice from an Uruguayan perspective, but not from a WTO perspective. And then we were many times something, to say, okay, we need to change this regulation. This goes against WTO trade rules. We implemented it. And all the wind farms have local content. So this is another decision that you have to take. Yeah, we know that the multilateral organizations are going to say, no, you shouldn't go this way, industrial policy space. We don't have the same industrial policy space as in the 70s. You have to acknowledge that. But sometimes what you need to do is just ignore that. And that's it. This is what we do. Results. What are the results of this policy? So sorting out these dilemmas with, again, lights and shadows. What we achieved, so you already know some of the pictures. So basically we have these huge investments in wind, 2014. We also have this wind growth capacity growing at a rate of even above 20%, and the capacity, of course, was also increasing. I just put this in terms of comparing, what is the situation with the world. Basically, I have these figures from 2016. In terms of the energy, global primary mix, Uruguay is around 55%, and in terms of the electric mix, we are around 94%. I think right now it's 97, but it doesn't matter. I mean, we made this transition in, as I told you before, 3-4 years. What is important in terms of climate change, one of the things that we addressed in yesterday's panels, this is actually the level of GHG emissions in Uruguay. I think it's one of the lowest. I think the lowest country in the world is Cuba. And then I don't know, Uruguay is there. So this is the results that you can see from the policy. And of course, we remember the first dilemma, the dependency dilemma, the sovereignty dilemma. We went from being a net importer to being now a net exporter, mainly to Argentina and Brazil, which is kind of crazy if you think about the resources that Brazil and Argentina have. And finally, I would say that the company, and I'm going to address one key issue here that was already raised in the previous panel. Actually, this is the profit of the company. So the company is not running into deficit because of the transition. Okay. But I want just to mention one thing, which I think is important. The price. Because another dimension is, okay, we need to give cheap electricity to every house. The prices in Uruguay have not been decreasing. But I need to tell you why. And it has nothing to do with the cost of production, the subsidies, the technology, whatever you mentioned. It's a political decision. Why? Because we are asking our state-owned company to finance our budget deficit. So the money that they make is not used to lower electric prices. It's a political decision, but it's used to finance the budget deficit, which right now is around 40%. And I was going to ask you this question: what is the role of ESCOM? I don't know what is the balance that you have during the last 20 years in financing other things which are not related with the company's business. Yeah, and in that case, we could not transfer what we did to the prices of house. And this is crucial. It's politics. It's not economics, technology, or production. So to finish, the conclusions. This is what I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just going to tell you in 5 different main objectives. These are all the tools that you can use if you want to, between brackets or whatever you might call it, industrialize your country. All these tools, you can still use them. Yeah. Even though I said this thing related with the WTO. So you could try to develop legal and policy frameworks, like we did in renewable energies, local capacity building, you need different measures to do that. I put it like standard menu for latecomers. This is what we are. And finance FDI or linkages that you want to do. And everything that is on the right-hand side are different measures that you need to take with trade, financing, you name it, human capabilities, whatever. We still have that. What I think, and this is my slide, my two last slides, is that one of the things that we need to be very clear about is what are our real potentials. One of the things that we did in Uruguay, and when I'm talking about industrial transformation, I'm not only talking about manufacturing transformation. I'm taking into account the agricultural system, the industrial system, and the services sector. Uruguay is mainly an agricultural country. So we cannot ignore, even when we are talking about manufacturing, what is the connection between industry or manufacturing and agro and industry and services. We have to think about that very carefully. So in Uruguay, we define it, and we are still working in these 10 sectors. We thought that we have oil and gas in our maritime platform. We don't. So this is why I put this between brackets. So this is the way I think also to work, yeah? To think ahead and to plan in 8, 9, 10 sectors. Of course, those who are against industrial policy would not like that. They say you give the correct incentives, and then the economy is going to charge off. And what has been happening in Uruguay and in Latin America, you are getting soya, pulp mill, cellulose, iron, copper, you know the drill. We haven't been able to add value to what we export. So in a sense, I think I have only included here 2 dimensions. I think every tool that I mentioned before can be think in these dimensions of what are the extremes and what is your choice, your policy choice in between. Yeah, I'm only choosing 2 examples. For example, if you want to think about the value chain positioning, yes, adding value to what you do, you can go from micromanagement, yeah, to set the stage for economic growth, a more liberal and a more interventionist approach. I think, comrades, if you are talking about, we know our natural resources, there is not an option. Micromanagement, state-owned, and that's the end of the story, and there is no discussion about that. You talk about any natural resources that you have, and we need to be very clear and focused about that. It's not because we want to, or this is our ideology. This is how the world works. This is how the big geopolitical players, China and the like, are working, and have been working for the last 200, 300 years. The natural resources are our own, and we need, of course, to manage them very good. If you talk to me about producing textiles, or leather, or shoes, I will not say that micromanagement is a good solution. And I'm coming from the left, and I will tell you that honestly. I don't need to have a state-owned enterprise, and I'm telling you that you can laugh, but we did that in many Latin American countries. Many Latin American countries implemented factory managed by the state at this level. I don't think this is necessary. We need to think about other alternatives. I will think not only on the private sector, I will think about worker-owned factories, about cooperatives, and I will think about the framework for them to produce. Because we did that in Uruguay, we gave them a fund, $200 million were given, and I was in charge of the fund, National Development Fund for worker-owned factories. We failed completely and miserably. You know why? Because we were giving money to them and nothing else. So what I was telling the guys while we were negotiating these finances, I was telling them, why don't we give them something like a 20-year PPA to them? So the state is buying the shoes that you produce for 20 years. This is much better than financing. Why are we not giving them capacity and training? Because they know how to work, they know how to arrange their own production, but they don't do marketing. They don't do R&D. So we're just giving them money, well, they're going to, unfortunately, throw them out. And I finish with this. Another possible dimension, there are many of them, of course, is the public-private coordination mechanism, everything that we have been discussing here too. I really don't mind there if there is a book written, white paper, Bible, reveal truth about what we need to do in terms of planning, or if it is just something implicit, connection with people, a consensus that is reached, and things that start to work, even if it is not written in a paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Sean, would you like to make some initial observations before I open up to...
I just have a couple of things to say. I was originally on the agenda thanks to the organizers, but I sort of offered to remove myself because I felt there's so much knowledge in the room and I've spoken already. So, but I would like to, these discussions about domestic, and I think in the left we kind of made a bit of a fetish of the idea of domestic production, part of the import, substitution thinking, or global south development. We need our own stuff. So I think your comments, Sebastian, were very, modern and on target in terms of this. But one of the questions I think pertains to South Africa is the barriers of entry to new solar PV, because wind is a little bit more complicated, at least my sense, and that will be a surplus of PV on the global markets in the coming years because of the ending of the feed-in tariff in China is expected to free up as much as 20 gigawatts of capacity of oversupply, which means the prices are going to continue to fall. Years ago, it would have been called dumping. You know, basically they'll unload it cheap. So is that a better option in the short term than trying to build up the domestic solar industry and then coming across conflicts with the WTO? We all have strong opinions about the WTO. I actually think in some circumstances you should ignore the directives and basically press on, because they still got to collect the fines. And in the end of the day, it's about your credit ratings. And you know, when in the case of something like Eskom, I don't think it can do any more damage to Eskom's credit ratings. So I don't want to go there because it's beyond my realm of knowledge. Another issue is which came up earlier this morning that pertains to domestic production. If we look how India is developing its solar industry, it's got third-party developers negotiating with the governments and the energy system. Much of it's still state-owned or regulated, but it's importing all of its PV from China. Now, they negotiated low bids on power purchase agreements in order to try to meet, and they're not meeting it, but try to meet Modi's renewable energy targets, which are very aggressive, something like 220 gigawatts by 2022 under the Paris Agreement. I think they've installed 20, 30 gigawatts. I may be wrong about that, but they're way, way behind this target, which was a PR exercise on behalf of the Indian government anyway. But where I'm going with this is once the auctions the prices were determined, Chinese companies then immediately raised the price of PV by 20%. And this meant that the Indian third-party developers that aren't producing their own PV then are in a situation where they either got to renegotiate with their own government or basically be forced out of business. And my understanding of it is that that the Chinese manufacturers knew that these companies were legally locked in to supply power at a certain price, and they had nowhere to go. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I think this underscores these global supply chains. It does underscore the needs for more control at the local level of your own production. And that does mean that even though in the short term prices of buying on world markets might take advantage of economies of scale elsewhere, might be an option. Over the longer term, and in case of creating domestic employment, skills transfer, close to market, the sort of relationships Sebastian was talking about, there needs to be a domestic PV industry. And if we talk about the projections in terms of PV capacity and wind capacity in South Africa being so high that the problems of variable renewable power are much less than they are in other countries, then we're probably talking about a 10, 20, 30 gigawatt industry if you put wind and solar combined. That should be made in South Africa. If that means coming up against the WTO, so be it. You know, I think this needs to be pushed very aggressively and say to the WTO, you are burning the planet because you're stopping our decarbonization, you're condemning us to poverty, and we are not accepting these conditions, and we're rallying with other regions around the world who had it up to here with the WTO and these restrictions on domestic content. So disobey the law. It's not a law anyway. It's not a just law. And build, I would think, the options of building a domestic solar and perhaps a wind industry over the medium term are quite favorable. That's what I think.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that, Sean. Okay, so we do have. Okay, we run out of time.
We can go a little bit into lunch.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It's about 1:15.
1:15, yeah.
Yeah. It's open. I'm not going to do the distinctions of questions of clarity and because like Dinga, because people obviously there's a kind of
That's my style.
yeah, we know how that goes. So let's just open up. You can ask questions, you can make observations. And I'm going to run a list. So Salim, what's it? Barbara, your name?
Okay.
Richard, and then Sam. Okay, right.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you raise a very good point because over the last 10 years, part of my work has been looking at industrialization in the renewable sector. And so in terms of the WTO, government purchases, we can work around the WTO. By the way. And in some countries, in fact, like France, if they want local manufacturing, they also can get around WTO on the basis of carbon standards and also proximity of the location of the wind sites and so on. So there's different ways in which they get around it. So there are ways. I think the challenge here is that we often think very nationally about our energy system, but it's actually a globalized system. If you look at how finances work and how procurement of equipment happens, also the certification of this equipment from original equipment manufacturers, it's a global thing. We try to build a wind blade manufacturing company in South Africa. The banks would not accept the certification because, in fact, it was a German company that set it up with DC de Dorval, which was an old industrial maritime company. It failed because the banking system, in terms of the bankability of projects, especially in the first rounds, would not accept the certification. They didn't meet the certification requirements. So there's lots of challenges around certification. It's not just about putting a plant up and manufacturing. It's about whether a local company can actually meet the certification requirements and whether it meets the conditions of the financiers. So this is some of the challenges we have. The second part is that it's a global value chain. The mature industries are well established, especially for wind. It's a bit like car automation. Automation is very easy to move from one country to another, provided the standard engineering applies. All you're doing is moving to cheaper location in terms of labor and other types of incentive. That's basically what the Chinese did with PV. It's very difficult for South Africa to compete with it, and lots of our PV assembly, like Tessel and all of these French companies that were based here, have been basically wiped out by the REIPP program. So we've got to recognize that there's some realities around the fact that this is a globalized industry. There's surplus production in China, largely led by what you just said, and that will continue for a long while. In fact, there's a big case going on in WTO now of dumping issues in Germany because it's starting to affect their own industries. My frank view is that standardized PV panels, we're probably not going to be able to compete with the Chinese. We might have to look at higher value PV panels in which there's a stronger emphasis on R&D and efficiency in the technology. We probably have to look at thin film. We've looked at concentrated solar power. There's lots of room for innovation there. But as the gentleman said, it's a cost issue. But if we took an industrial point of view, not just an electricity generation point of view, and looked at it over a 30, 40-year period, then CSP, in my view, given our analysis, we've just done the whole report I can send to you, we would have much more spin-offs and we'd be able to generate competitive flagship companies because there's strategies of actually getting those companies to operate here. And it's very aligned with some of our existing industrial capacity. It's not true for PV. PV is very linked with semiconductor industry. There's a whole cluster of other knowledge-based industries that are associated with it. And that's how that industry works. Wind is pretty much out of our league at the moment because it's so well established. It's a highly consolidated industry. If we want to be involved in the global value chain, we must think of particular components that we can manufacture. Some of tracking devices are even being manufactured in countries like Slovenia that sell it to South African companies here. So there's a lot of interesting stuff around CSP, not just in the hardware, but also the software and the actual engineering of the location of the sites and precision of the mirrors that you have to focus on the sun. So lots of knowledge can be generated because it touches on the thing about what is tradable in terms of exports. There are two things that are tradable. The knowledge is tradable, the services that go with it, and the hard engineering. The third part is also R&D. So we must think of it in those types of ways. But I think that standardized PV is going to be tough for us to get into.
Thanks, Salim. I think that, I mean, my assumption is that you've answered the question in the positive. The question is, should South Africa
I think
be
we're going to focus,
focusing
we're going to
on-
understand the global value chain and then figure out which one of those parts we can play a big role. But we can't assume we're going to be able to become industrialized in PV, in the whole thing, which is not feasible.
Thanks. So we have Barbara next.
Thank you both for the presentation. Just a point, there was a news article that came out last night, which collaborates actually your point on what's the terms of the Chinese agreement. So South Africa enters a 15 billion rand trade pact with the Bank of China for industrial development. And included in the deal will be the construction of a 4,600 megawatt coal-fired power plant over the next 6 years. This came out last night.
Is this for the FOCAC meeting?
It's the President's agreement with the Chinese.
Chinese.
The coal-fired power plant going to be in Limpopo in
Does this include the Chinese bringing their own workers? Does this include the Chinese bringing their own technologies? These are the questions that we need to ask.
And more question is, how much money are you going to use for these new factories? How much money to pay them? I still think that you're paying them with this money, but this is just an idea.
Okay, good. So that's information from the previous session.
Russia's point is that we need to find out what are the terms of the Chinese.
Yeah.
Interest rates.
Yeah.
Okay, no, what I'm asking is, this session is going to be dealing with, so that is obviously a span in the works if we wanted to shift and shift an industrial policy towards renewables when we're still investing in coal and getting foreign investment in coal. So,
Is this an additional coal plant?
it's an additional
Yes,
coal
an
plant.
additional one that would include stainless steel plants and ferrochromium and manganese plants.
And a cement factory. over the next few
And a
years.
cement factory on top of it.
And there goes our carbon budget. Okay.
Told us to learn that.
And it's not even in the IRP.
It's not in the
It's not
IRP,
in the IRP.
but you will soon find it in the IRP. Because it's not that there's a policy adjustment happening, I'm sure.
It's not on the chart.
Okay, thank you for that. And we must put this as part of, I mean, that's a very important piece of this conversation. Are you carrying on?
No, I just want to agree that we need to get consensus whether we're going to transition to renewable energies or not. It does not only include political will, but also backing from unions, authorities, and private sector. We can't be saying one thing, but the government is going in a different direction. So it's important discussions like that.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. Daniel.
Yeah, I only want to add a footnote to the comment about the WTO. I think we shouldn't minimize the role of the WTO preventing this kind of development. And we should also be aware that it's not only the WTO. There are a lot of bilateral trade and investment agreements that put a lot of restrictions. It was not by chance, for instance, that Uruguay decided to pull out of TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement, because it had a huge impact on the state-owned enterprises. Even in the case of Uruguay, especially in the area of telecoms, which is we have a really good, well-functioning telecom, and TISA would have affected that. And also, we have to remember that there is something that affects energy in particular. We just published a report on the Energy Charter Treaty that not many people talk about, because this was a treaty that was dormant for many years, and now some corporations are trying to use it to prevent the energy transition. So far, it is being signed only by 48 countries, but the main forces behind this treaty such as the European Union, for instance, Canada, the US, are pushing a lot of countries in the South, including South Africa, to join the Energy Charter Treaty. So we have to be aware of these. We just produced a report. I gave a copy to some of you, but if you want to know more about this, it's available for free on the TNI website.
Right. No, thank you very much. It's important, and especially since South Africa, because you're looking at an Africa being part of, an Africa free trade agreement. And we need to keep our fingers on all of those initiatives. Richard H.
Okay, well, the first thing I was going to point out has already been pointed out, this article from the Business Day, which was yesterday, about this Chinese deal for this 4.6 gigawatt power plant. Because if that suddenly comes on board, the presenters were just talking about you need a political basis. And if now your political basis is, hey, we're going to build more coal-fired power, then the transition sort of disappears anyway. So I think this is a real big issue, and I don't know whether we need to talk about specifically this conference, but it is a big thing. Yeah. But the second thing I wanted to add, seeing that I already mentioned, is we saw Richard had a graph, in the UK, 85% decline in coal-fired power in the last 5 years. Lots of other examples of renewables going up and coal going down. And yet, when Sean was speaking yesterday, there's this other trend of investment being taken out of renewables. So I'm a bit confused. You have indications of transition towards renewables, but you also have indications of people backing out. And I'm not quite sure how these two necessarily come together.
All right. I'm going to take
I know there's a few more waiting.
Sam, and then you can respond to that, and I'll take the next round of hands. Sam.
Okay, I was just going to make a couple of points, and I have a question for Sebastian. And thanks for the presentation, so it was really good. On the coal phase-out question and the drop-off, I mean, really, the coal drop-off happened in the 80s and 90s. 250,000 workers kicked out the industry through the industrialisation programme, and a very political attack as well on trade unions, because obviously that's one of the most militant, well-organised sectors. But that was very deliberately done as part of what we call Dash for Gas, and promoting the North Sea oil and gas resources. So the government had a plan which is underway at the moment, to phase out coal-fired generation completely by 2025. So there's no correlation between the renewable sector and the coal phase out there, but what's being pushed is the gas industry. So that's why there's this drive towards fracking. There's a deliberate government investment program called Maximising Economic Recovery of North Sea oil and gas resources, which everybody, even industry, say will run out by 2030, but there's absolutely no transition plan out from North Sea oil. So it's a complete mess. As I said just then, this is all vested interests that are obviously playing a part in here. The other side of that is nuclear, so they're pushing nuclear. And there's an interesting correlation there, which you wouldn't have in South Africa, but probably in the US as well, between the military agenda and the civil nuclear agenda, which is more coming to light. So just point on that. I think the examples of Uruguay are really important and something to learn from. And I mean, it was a really interesting first discussion this morning. I've got a headache at the moment. There's just so much information in the room, and I'm sort of trying to think of this in terms of our discussions in the UK. So we have this situation in South Africa, ESCOM, and already a state-owned enterprise, and what we're trying to do in the UK, obviously what you've achieved in Uruguay. But I think the political question is a really important one. And again, if you may remember when I opened up my presentation yesterday, was a remark that we've actually got to the point where we are in the UK because we've got different political space right now to have these kind of conversations. That didn't exist 2 years ago. But I'm interested to know about the sustainability of the political support for it in Uruguay and how much this is embedded, including with the industrial policy, because I think it's very closely linked in, and also to discussions about the sort of homegrown industries. Because one of the problems we have in the UK, and it's certainly not going to be unique or surprising, the comment about getting trade unions on board is obviously the jobs issue. And where a lot of good unionised jobs are at the moment are in the fossil fuel industries. So it's kind of where the job's going to be. So the flippant response is, well, they're being renewables. Well, as we've already seen, that's not happening in renewables, and plus they're not good, well-paid unionised jobs. So there's a problem there. But what we're trying to develop is a different kind of narrative and conversation. What we frame in our unit is a whole economy industrial approach. So we're not just talking about transferring into renewables, but actually start making stuff again. So I think that whole kind of mapping around what can we do locally is really, really important. So I guess my question is, and this is a very live question actually within the Labour Party right now in the UK, and part of how they're trying to redesign the energy system is making it kind of sustainable to future political attacks if they come out of power. And some of this will be more specific to local political situations, but obviously we have these 5-year parliaments. So a lot of our policy making is always done on a 5-year vision, which is one of the particular problems we have. So that was the question there.
Okay. I'm going to take you, Sean, but I think that the one element of this, and maybe Sebastian, you could also talk about this, is the issue of the way you shifted and the political consensus that you had as the left in Uruguay. Doesn't mean that there's going to be political consensus in South Africa, possibly, because we don't have a left. But I'll make that decision. But what was the left's vision of their economic model, actually? There was a lot of the kind of industrialization policies that we have, or our energy systems, etc. It's located within an existing economic model. Did the left in Uruguay present an alternative? And does your energy systems and your those social things fit into that different economic model? Was this all within an existing hegemonic economic model that's dominating? That's just connecting to that as well. We can't talk transformation of energy systems without actually looking at the broader transformation, I would think. Sean.
Yeah, I'll just come back. Is it Richard? Richard? Yeah, Richard's question of why is, with the collapse of coal in the UK, and why is investment there, basically flooding out of the system, out of the energy system. In this document, Preparing a Public Pathway, it goes into the story of the UK, and I'll give it the short version in the interest of time. Essentially, it was the first country to privatize the power sectors under Thatcher, which then became a global model across the OECD, at least. Then it was the first. Then the feed-in tariff model was the way to subsidize renewables at pay above the market price, and that accumulated a legacy cost for consumers in the realm of £100 billion. I don't know what that is in rand. It's about 130 billion dollars. So you can do a quick mathematical.
And that's by 15. We've just gone over the 15 mark for the dollar.
Okay. But that means that these power purchase agreements on the feed-in tariff, these commitments, is going to cost the consumer that much money over a period. Now, this prompted the electricity market reform in 2011, when the national regulator said, we've got 3 problems. And I'm mentioning this because why did investment go out of the system? First of all, the first problem was, if you put risk in the system with competition, then you're going to be in a situation where nobody wants to invest in that system, whether it be the incumbent generators or the renewables generators. So what then happens is you have, especially in a country like Britain, where you've got a lot of aging capacity and no new investment coming into the system. So their reaction was, to basically go to cut the feed-in tariff, go to a competitive bidding system, which again, Britain was the first to introduce competitive bidding, which then became European Union policy, which has now become global policy in many parts, or at least in many parts of the world. This is then to control the costs of renewables and limit the deployment, to slow down the decarbonisation and to reduce the costs. All of this contributes risk. And then the last factor, which we mentioned yesterday and came up in Celine's contribution, is this death spiral of the utilities, because then they are now, their business model is undercut. They raise their prices. They're stuck in this situation, and they then say, if you want to have security of supply in the years ahead, you don't have enough stable renewables to handle the situation. You've got to pay us above market price. So you get a situation where everybody is paid above market price now. Everybody is subsidized in order to sustain the system. It's enforced chaos, and what it does for the investment is it just makes investors say, enough, there's far too much risk in this system, we're not putting money in this, and therefore they run for the exits. And this is a global crisis. Thus, my last point, you mentioned selling the International Energy Agency, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, all of these people are scratching their head like, oh, we wanted the free market because we thought it would open the door to new players in renewables. Now we've got a situation where there's so much risk, we don't have the investment we need to carry out the decarbonisation. So we're in a quandary here, and what do we do about it? And so they're at that stage at the moment. But explains the falling off of investment in renewable energy globally, beginning in Europe, where the collapse has been precipitous, but increasingly around the world, we're going to see more fall off of investment when we need to be at least 3 times higher every year to reach anything close to the Paris targets. So a little speech in the context of an answer to a question. Thank you.
Ben, thanks.
Yes, I would know, the UK was not the first.
Okay.
The second, Chile was.
Oh, Chile, all right, sorry.
Can we take on comments? Don't worry about the time.
Yeah, I just, there's been a pretty huge gap in the conversation. So I'd like to hear from the trade union. We've heard from Sebastian that in fact it was the trade union in Uruguay that forged those alliances, that built the consensus, that had this vision. Now we're asking, should South Africa have such a vision? Should we be aiming for a renewable energy future that has a very strong industrial base? And what role would the unions need to play if we said yes? So the union voices have been a bit quiet. So maybe if we could hear from those in the room who from trade unions. Anybody?
I'm willing to answer that.
You want to answer?
Yes.
You know, we have a big challenge, Sebastian. In South Africa, we need to hear what.
No, but to share with them because I'm not going to see them again. So,
All right.
to share what I think, but it's okay. I mean, I honestly believe that sometimes if you build platforms, I don't know, Brian is here. Brian, if you build platforms only on some very abstract things in terms of what people understand, it's difficult to struggle to fight against something. So I'm thinking in a very practical way. You are getting these things about the Chinese right now. You need to use these small fights in order to build a broader platform. So what I will do is, what I think, and you have been fighting for your wages in the last 2 weeks, I read in the newspaper, and you won that battle, is going, I think, beyond that. So now you have many things that are being discussed right now. But what perhaps you need to use to organize this fight is one particular thing, this Chinese loan. What is this loan about? We demonstrate. I think from a sovereignty perspective, it's very pernicious. This is what I believe. I might be wrong, I might be right. But you can use this as an excuse to build a new platform related with industrial policy, the transition to renewable energies, and the like. But you need to organize and be on the streets. This is my answer. If I was a trade union, this is the only way in which you are going to eventually have a consensus with the government, with the political party who is in charge of this system. Otherwise, it's impossible. Uruguay was a different case. I mean, completely different. Yeah, the union was negotiating with the political system. I don't think this is going to happen. With very little knowledge of how it's happening in politics. But you need to have your own plan. You need to build it.
Yes.
Mm.
Thanks,
And then I want to refer to the
so, well, trade unions in South Africa has a long history of being exactly. We've reached a bit of a crisis though. The interesting thing would be, let's use the Chinese investment as an example. There might be trade unions who believe that that Chinese investment is going to save Eskom, which will save jobs. And so therefore, they might not think that launching a campaign against Chinese investment is something that they would want to do, as an example. These are the hard things happening in South Africa today around whether we're going to phase out coal, what kind of future we want. Everything revolves around jobs and in defense of jobs. And so it would be really good to hear from the trade unions whether in their own work that they're doing, I know that many trade unions have research capacity, etc., whether they've looked at the renewable energy sector as a future industrial job creating sector in the country. And what kinds of platforms would we use to build that consensus around it, and whether we can do this with trade union leadership. I know that many other sectors of society are looking to the trade unions to lead.
And I don't think it's going against the Chinese. Misinterpret my words. It's going against the secrecy of the deals between the two governments. So what we want to have is, George, okay, tell me, what is this loan about in terms of my job? Of course, I agree with you. Maybe the Chinese can say, but I don't know, because I don't know the deal. What is the deal about? So you will fight for the secrecy, for the right as trade unions to define the policy of your company. This is what you should do. Get in the same table and eventually negotiate with them what they are talking with the Chinese. This is what we will ask as a trade union, not just being against the Chinese. Of course, you cannot be against the Americans, the Chinese just in certain instances. But anyway, just
like the Russian nuclear deal.
Makoma.
Yeah. Okay, and the Chinese loan, particularly because there's no transparency and we know how the Chinese operate in different countries. They actually have captured Africa. Everywhere in an African continent where you find Chinese companies, you find an influx of Chinese laborers in those particular countries. And I would think that that would be the same. That's what's going to happen now, particularly with this, I think it's triple or double loan, but I'm not convinced that it's the only two loans that we know publicly. There may be more of that. But the one, I think those who may be aware that in construction sites like Kusile and Midupi, whenever a construction company comes, they come with nationals of that particular country to work. So this is particularly, I think, what's going to do, and that should be a welcome aspect. As some civil society organizations, we have been following up and checking as to what does the law mean to South Africa. Particularly, it was given to ESCOM, which is mismanaged. I think we all agree with that. The ESCOM board has turned a blind eye on all the reports that were done around their mismanagement and touching on also a whole lot of stuff around ESCOM. And for the mere fact that the Chinese gave ESCOM a loan knowingly of the situation, I think the situation of ESCOM is not like confined to South Africa, the whole world knows about it. But they gave that. So there's more to this. And we've issued a statement as an organization last week when we learned about this trip of the presidents and the presidency and the school of whoever. He's with a school in China now. He's not just alone. Raising issues around transparency, raising issues around the safety of environmental justice activists like ourselves. I think we're living on the edge. We're not sure about our safety, and we know what China does. And the more the laws become active, I think this is something that we all need to take, but particularly also the trade unions. We're going to see an influx of Chinese workers coming to this country, and that will be tied to the contract or the loan agreement. So this is something that I think all of us should just stand up and try to stop. Yes, we didn't win with the others around the other loans from African Development Bank, from the World Bank, but at least we have some sort of experience and an insight as to what is that we can do. I would, if we come together and start raising this kind of issues, I think that would be important. And we raised that in the morning to say, if we really want to do something right, we need to come together and work, as a force, as a united force, so that we can be able to turn the situation to be to our benefit.
Okay, thanks, Makoma. I just want to just do a quick, just a time out on the conversation itself, because it's an absolutely important and relevant conversation, which I hope, Sandra, you guys will be picking up again in your deliberations tomorrow. But the session is very clearly titled, should South Africa be focusing on growing a local renewable energy sector? Of course, this issue of the Chinese investment, etc., detracts, has a huge potential to detract from that. And so we must be aware of it. But it's also important for us to have this conversation about growing a renewable energy sector as a key sector in South Africa. And so I'd like to hear, we've heard perspectives from Uruguay, really important perspectives. We've heard Richard tell us about how he got it mostly wrong in South Africa. We've heard about looking at this as a global value chain. So I'd like to hear more thoughts about this as potentially a growing sector as part of our overall industrial plans for the country. And we're not getting to that point. So Buya will tell us what NUMSA feels about this.
So this things Tasmin.
Tasmin.
What Tasmin?
Yes.
There's another Tasmin, that's all I know something. But the point is, I think first to take from the presentation by Richard earlier, where he articulated the need for a planned and managed transition and phase out from coal, which is a position that NUMSA is clearly comfortable with and we endorse it. Okay? So we don't be misunderstood. We're very clear about it. Secondly, on the renewables, NUMSA is resolved long time ago, as early as 2011, 2012, that renewables is the future for our economy, for our country, for our society. Very clear. And not any other renewables than the IPPs, which we oppose and reject as a union, as a form of acceptable renewable energy in our country. We are for socially owned renewable sector, not the clean democratic controls, and to make sure that that sector is grown. Is grown to make sure that jobs are created, that climate emission issues are also set. So we're very clear about that. We don't want to confuse it. Now on the Chinese issue, because it's shocking to hear today that there is another coal-fired power stations that we open. I can't believe that. We are shocked to hear that. After Medupi, there's these two coal IPPs, Kanisa and in the water plant. Coal. We should not have any coal production, any electricity from coal power stations. We struggle, and I think, and the point has been raised that these deals and agreements and are very secretive. They're not transparent. It is a real problem. But for us, we should start demanding and fighting for answers, fighting for disclosure, discovery of all these other things, so that we can, start also to drive a program and campaign around these issues. Because there can't be any deals that are made. Include, loan deals that are made that we don't know about, that we must pay for. The terms have not been discussed with us as communities, as civil society, as trade unions. One of the challenges is that the trade unions have not really occupied the space in energy. Very few trade unions. One of the missions that we have in few trade unions, 1 or 2 or 3. So I think it's the first problem. The SAFTU and the society So it's a challenge that we need, and with NUM particularly in ESCOM, as NUMSA, we are here that we have managed to work more than in any other year before in the current wage negotiations or the budget just concluded, and on energy we should be working together and more. So that all these issues are exposed, so that we build the social power, public power, and we make sure that we grow the economy, we grow the renewable sector in a socially oriented direction.
Thanks, Congressman. So we'll carry on talking about your proposals around what in the sector can be grown, etc. But we'll come to that again. Singa, maybe you can share some insights.
I can see just you're pushing the unions. Yeah?
Union leadership.
No, I think what the comrades in Uruguay did is commendable. Again, the context is important. But I do think that it's important to note some of the attempts by unions here, without sometimes glorifying that and also learning lessons from that. And I just want to give you a couple of When there was the announcement of a sort of installation of 1 million solar with water heaters by government, we said Labour now, set exactly similar forum with the manufacturers. We mapped out what capacities exist in the country, and we identified 3 key manufacturers. JWG, Giza, one in Benin. And we did all of that, and we brought in the state. And I'm cutting what it was a long process and a long meetings and discussions, where we again, the pragmatic approach. When we spoke to what kind of manufacturing exists in the country, the economics of that, taken for not just South Africa, for Southern Africa, we reached an agreement which became gazetted with the government that the tanks, the domes, the frames will be done in South Africa. And the Department of Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davis designated that 62% of this will be locally produced. We got into the discussion on how you duck the WTO, because this was going to be a government driven program. We would be able to run away and avoid some of the WTO directives. From a practical point of view, not an ideological point of view, when we looked at the people and what it will be to compete with the Chinese manufacturers on the cubes that you put on the panel, we came to an agreement that the cubes will be imported from China as units. We agreed on that, and that the bulk of the manufacturing would happen here. And all of this was assigned and agreed, and that this will be a way of stimulating the manufacturing capacity of the solar water heaters in South Africa. Now we know that that program collapsed, and that the targets were not met. And the reason for that, and the many reasons, is that the model of delivery was then there were problems with the municipalities. Sometimes some of the work not being done properly. There were sort of issues with the program. A model of delivery was moved from into what was called a contract model, and that the program was going to be warehoused at ESCOM. We just saw the collapse of the program. I mean, there are many reasons, and that the sort of emerging manufacturing capacity. CWJ Giza closed. These companies closed because the program wasn't moving. So I'm just giving you just one example of where, similar to what I mean, I can go to the sort of wind industry again, where we sat down and said, look, what capacities for the gearbox, for this, oh, the blades? No, we can't do. There isn't much that we can do. And again, the department was quite prepared to designate and say what kinds of local content and this will do with the sort of manufacturing industry. I'm not saying that the unions, we should have continued that as unions. I think the fragmentation of the unions and all the political made things much more different. But I think that there were concrete attempts to look at this from practical, and I think this idea that the unions just say socially owned in an ideological manner is not correct, and it's not, and sometimes it doesn't help to build the relationships. Appreciating some of the concrete work that some of the unions have done.
Thank you very much, Dinga. I think that was a really important insight. And for me, the lesson here is, firstly, a lot of that work was very quiet. And those who were involved in it knew about it, but maybe it's the practical work that needs to happen with the kind of public-facing campaign type things, because when things go wrong, you need support to fight for things to go right again. And so maybe there are some lessons that the unions who were involved in this might want to write up and document for us, It's a really important lesson. And maybe you have experiences from Uruguay that, could help with this kind of, we've done the work, but then it doesn't get delivered.
I think what the comrade was saying, I mean, it happened the same thing in Uruguay. We knew in advance that manufacturers were not going to be able to produce in time what we need. We knew in advance that we were going to have very problematic logistics issues, and we had that. What we did was, apart from reaching this agreement, this collective, consensus, we asked something very specific, and this is where sometimes the policy fails. You need to sign a decree by the president which tells you multinational corporations or state-owned enterprises, you have to do it with 20% local content. I don't care if you do it in 6 months, in 1 year, in 2 years. The way in which you impose your vision is when you have the regulation that actually compels you to do it. Otherwise, it's just, good wording. Saying, okay, we're going to develop this with you, trade unions, we like you, so we're going to, construct this 2-power station. But this is okay, but I see that as phase 1. The phase 2 is the signature. What is the final signature in the decree or in the law or in the regulation system that actually tells the multinational corporation or the firms, the private sector, the national private sector, that there is no other way. So if you don't include a tower which is produced in Uruguay or in Brazil or in Argentina, you are not going to be able to auction for this huge development that we want to do in the renewable sector. And that's the end of the story. And the problems, of course, need to be solved. But it's the other way around. Because if you start to look at our industrial policy and say, look, we have all these problems that we all have as underdeveloped and third world countries or whatever you call it, from the global south. And after that, we are going to give you the decree in a proper way for you to have this 20% local content participation. I'm sorry, this is not going to happen. So what we need is, you gave us the degree, and then we see how we sort out our problems. And then you get the people working in the metal machine sector, in the construction sector, and the like, from this small execution.
Yeah. So South Africa's REAP program has a localization condition, and it didn't happen. It didn't materialize. There were attempts, as I think it was, I didn't know, Richard, in your presentation, when you spoke about this, the manufacturing sector, where they sort of started up, and then we had a lot of policy uncertainty, and the REAP program went on a pause, etc., and a lot of companies shut down. So it is a package of things, I understand, that there's the regulation, but there's a whole lot of other things that need to, the political basis, the general consensus in society, that the trade unions will lead in building, forging those alliances, building the capacity of South Africans to be able to enter into those sectors, etc., etc. So I think there's a whole complex set of conditions that we need to put in place for us if we want to grow a renewable energy sector. But there's an immediate campaign that seems to be emerging as a proposal out of this workshop maybe, that you take on these side deals that's happening in secret, that's preventing us from getting policy certainty and from building a renewable energy sector. So I think on that note, we can break for lunch. And thank you very much for your participation, your contributions, Richard and Sebastian, and all of you. Enjoy your lunch, comrades.
Thank you. Can you come back at 2:30, I think? 2:20. Well,
Be strong.